Hello again, and welcome back to this week's presentations in politics of Southeast Europe. In this segment, I want to talk about institutions. In particular, I want to talk about what happens when institutions don't work. Because this is a part of the experience of the region over the past 100 years or so, with frequent changes of regime, frequent ambitious programs of reform, limited capacity in states, low institutional density of states in some parts of the territory of the state. You have a whole lot of resolutions that are described by law, that are prescribed by programs of political reform or the construction of institutions that do not work. And in the place of then institutions and procedures that do not work, informal practices are developed to compensate for these. Now, informal practices have a double character. We can look at them as expressions of creativity, of popular intelligence, ways of solving problems that are created by deficient institutions, or we can look at them in the conventional way that advocates of political and structural reform tend to look at them, that is to look at them as a problem that needs to be eliminated so that informal practices can be replaced by formal practices that are described by law. The information that I am about to present to you is information that is derived from a research project that has recently ended, which I coordinated. It involved about 40 researchers at 9 institutions throughout the region, inform on the gap between formal and informal practices in the Balkans. Now, we're working with a lot of ideas in this program, but the principal hypothesis is this: that when there is a misfit between the resolutions and practices that are described by law, that are meant to be embedded in institutions, and the ways that things are actually done, the informal practices, states become unworkable. This tends to undermine legitimacy most of the time. Some of the time, this is not what happens. Some of the time, informal practices can become a repository for ideas and procedures that can solve social problems that are created by formal resolutions. This is especially the case, for example, in the way that informal business, under the table business, can compensate for problems that are caused by formal discrimination, particularly in states where the principle of nationality and ethnicity has taken power. But most of the time when we're talking about informal practices, we're talking about using relationships and we're talking about using connections in order to accomplish work that people would usually expect to be accomplished through formal means. Let's look at some examples of how this works and how it operates in the region. In our survey, we asked people whether they agreed with the general statement. If you want to get the job done, you have to have your own people in important places and to have connections. Okay, and they were asked whether they agreed or disagreed on a scale. If they agreed completely that it was true, they would answer 10. If they did not agree at all, they answered 1. And as you can see, there's very little variation in the region. Just about everybody seems to agree that that this is the case. When we move into particular fields of activity, we can see that that this is still the case, although there's a bit more variation. So this question is a question about perception. I say, how often do you think it happens that people get a job through connections or through contacts? And as you can see, there are some places where the rate of perception of frequency of this is very high. Very, very high in Serbia, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in Montenegro. It is lower in some other places, lower in Kosovo, in Albania, and in Macedonia. But we could probably say that even with this variation, the perception is that this practice is fairly frequent. Now, I have to give a reservation here. When we ask people whether they have actually done this, used a connection to get employment, or been the connection that somebody else uses to get employment, then the response rate is much lower. So people seem to think that this happens, think that it's a dominant practice, much more than at least they will admit having participated in this practice. But let's go into a little bit of detail with this. we ask about the character of these connections. So when asked, how widespread do you think it is that somebody has to become a member of a political party in order to get a job, particularly a job in the public sector? Again, there is some variation. The rates of perception of frequency of this are lower in Kosovo and in Albania than in other places, but generally speaking, the perception is that it is fairly widespread. Now, this becomes important when we contrast these answers, even the answers in the states where the perception of frequency is relatively low, with the answers to the next question. How often do you think it happens that somebody gets a job based on merit, education, and experience? Okay, so gets a job through the normally expected formal means of getting a job. And again, there is some variation, not a ton of variation between states. Basically, what people are saying is that doesn't happen very much. So we not only see there's this very strong perception that the way that the system works is that to get something done, you need to have a connection. And these examples that I've just given you are for employment, but we have similar findings for education, for enrolling in an educational institution, for getting favorable decisions from a court, and so on. And we have something added to this, that people have identified political parties as the actor that is the most important perception. Let me show you now one of our more controversial findings. We asked people, now generally speaking, when we ask people, has it ever happened that you have participated in some informal practice, you find the level of response is much, much lower than the frequency with which they think it happens in the society, the frequency with which they think their neighbors or fellow citizens do it. But when we ask directly the question, have you ever been offered money or a favor in exchange for voting for a particular party in an elections, the positive answers are the ones that are noted in those blue columns there. The negative answers are in the orange, so still you have the majority of people saying no, but the answers range from a low of about 6.6% in Macedonia, although I should say in Macedonia, a very politically divided society, 6.6% is enough to change the result of an election. It is it is also low in Serbia and Kosovo, much higher. The highest rate of positive responses in this was in Montenegro. This is a result that might be partly explained by the practice being more frequent in Montenegro. It might also be explained by some of the difficulties we had with our sample in Montenegro. I can tell you that this survey result got us into a little bit of trouble because one of the results says 11% of people say, or no, excuse me, it was 19% of people saying that they had been offered money or a favor in exchange for a vote in Albania. We received a response from the former chair of the election commission of Albania, who said, we don't know who these people are or how they came up with this insane result. It is definitely not descriptive of the reality. As the former chair of the election commission, I can assure you that that number cannot be higher than 11 or 12%. But generally speaking, this is a practice that people report participating in, and they report participating in it in a number of environments at a level that can affect the results of elections, that can affect the composition of government. Now, this is important because also of the sorts of changes that people expected as societies became more integrated with Europe in the period after 2000. So when we asked people, what do they expect from increased integration with Europe and from the adoption of reforms that are imposed as a part of the conditionality for accession to the European Union? Now, generally speaking, most of the expectations that citizens have in most of the states, again, with some considerable variation, were positive. in general, they expected that adoption of reforms that are proposed or advocated by the European Union would result in improvements in administration, would result in improvements in efficiency, would result in reduction of corruption, and so on. But not all of the effects of these changes are experienced in everyday life. So if we compare these results with earlier results found by other researchers, even those positive expectations come to decline over time. And then look at the ones on this table here. People who expect that the effect of adoption of European-based reforms would be loss of cultural identity. Now, there are a couple of places where it seems like not very many people really perceive that as much of a risk or much of a problem. The response to that is fairly low in Albania and in Kosovo. It's relatively higher, about twice as high, in Macedonia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in Montenegro, and especially in Serbia, very, very high. Okay, so there is this element of not only hope, but also of anxiety that is associated with adoption of reforms that are advocated by or proposed as a part of integration with Europe and accession to Europe. Does this add up to something? Let me make um, a couple of suggestions here. First of all, one of the things that I think we can see for this is that there is a perception, a widespread perception among people in all of the states of the region, higher in some and lower in others, that institutions are not functioning the way that they ought to be functioning. And they want them to function in the way that they ought to be functioning. And in not inconsiderable degree, people associate this hope, they identify this hope with integration with Europe, with adoption of the kinds of reforms that the European Union would like the states in the region to adopt. But this positive desire exists in tension with a couple of other factors. It exists in tension with the fact that people do not feel the positive results that they expect in their day-to-day life, and I think it also exists in tension with the fear that people have that states will lose their identity, will lose their particularity, that people will lose power over their own lives through additional integration with Europe. I think it's one of the reasons why some of the anti-European discourse in contemporary societies is often expressed in terms of everyday activities of consumption. Things like consuming meat that is produced on farms, in particular farms that are owned by friends and relatives, producing things like local brandy and local cheese, and the conflict of this with both agricultural safety standards and with the flooding of the market with standardized goods. So the expectation that something good will happen is tempered by both the perception that the good things that were expected are not happening and that bad things can also happen.